Reading and rereading together. Introducing Heidegger. Alright, I'm kind of thinking that the Fab Four are probably not studying Heidegger in this picture. But it looks like they're really into something, I don't know what. And how nice to see people read together. Well, you know, that's what I hope we can enjoy doing in this course, reading together, amongst other things. Reading. Now, you know, I don't need you don't need me to tell you that reading well is a kind of a craft, and usually we don't have to bother about it as a craft. You know, we expect that what we read will make sense and that it will be more or less satisfying experience, hopefully, and that we only have to read it once. Well, in this video I'd like us to experience reading more as a kind of a craft, because we're going to be reading philosophy, and that is it requires a certain approach to our reading. So what we're going to do in this video is look at the first chapter of How to Read Heidegger, sort of as a deliberate craft, where we do things to take the time to pull out pieces of the text and start to have a conversation about it. At least that's what I'm going to try to model in this video, hopefully. Now, as your instructor, of course, I have an agenda. I have an agenda as to what I'd like you to take from the text. And as a result of having that agenda, I'm tempted to manage your interpretations along the lines I think are appropriate and worthwhile. And you're likely to see other things in the text that seem important, but that, for whatever reason, I don't focus on. So that could be frustrating, but please don't let go of that. If you see something that you think is important or confusing or whatever, or insightful, and it's not talked about very much or at all, make a note of it and we'll talk about it in class. So chapter 1 introduces us to some foundational ideas about Heidegger's philosophy. So let's get going with the book. And after some discussion of why Heidegger might be tricky to read, Rothel, I think Rothel is kind of concerned that we don't give up on him. Rothel says this, and I found this quote quite interesting, quite arresting really. As I walk through a park, I see trees and benches and dogs and other people. Well, of course we do. This sounds beautifully simple. We see things. And I suppose that's what Rothel means when he then says, each of them is a phenomenon, something I can experience. Okay, so what can be experienced is phenomenon. Well, this doesn't sound too out there, it sounds kind of obvious actually. But then Rothel goes on to say this. Okay, so he's bringing in science now, it looks like, the scientific account of things. And he's doing this, I think, because he's probably going to set two things against each other. For he goes on to say, but atoms, DNA, and minds don't show themselves as I walk through the park. They might announce themselves through the things that do appear, but I do not directly experience them. So what's being opposed here are the two things, experiencing things, and the word for things is phenomena, remember, with a scientific account of things. And the next paragraph on page 9 then goes on to explain more about this opposition. Read that paragraph now and decide what you think the heart of the matter is. Okay, I don't know about you, but I found Heidegger's definition of phenomenology a bit confusing. There are moments when I thought I understood it, but then when I went to put it in my own words, I got a bit stuck. Luckily, though, Rothel's gloss seems pretty easy to understand, at least I think so. Let's have a look at it. I'm going to highlight this phrase here, to stick with. The things that appear in experience and learn to see them in such a way that they show up as they really are. So I've highlighted the to stick with bit because I sense that Rothel and Heidegger are thinking it might be easy not to stick with this way of looking. And that this way of looking is not the same way as one influenced by science. I'm sensing it might require a special effort to stick with the things that appear in experience in order to learn to see them in such a way that they show up as they really are. The scientific way of looking at things is being opposed to this other phenomenological way then. So what's at the heart of this opposition exactly? Well, it would seem to me from reading this paragraph that it's to do with the difference between experience and cause. You know, we can have causal explanations of things, but this mustn't be confused with our experience of things. Now, there are lots of causal stories to be told. I feel like saying that it is science's job, really, to tell causal stories. The causal stories behind perception, for example. Light waves, biological processes, brain functions, and all of that. But what I see is a park bench, not light waves, not biological processes, not brain functions. I see a park bench. I think we should reflect on this a little bit. Because, you know, this opposition between phenomenology and the causal stories of science might make us a little uneasy. What's Heidegger up to here? I mean, is he saying that science isn't as real as our own experience? And if he is he being anti-scientific? What do you think? Well, I kind of think he isn't being anti-scientific, but then I'm prejudiced because I already know quite a bit about his thinking. That doesn't mean I could be wrong. I couldn't be wrong, of course. But I do think really what he's saying is that we must be honest when we consider human experience. You know, just honest about it. Because human experience is not to be reduced to a causal story without risk of distorting it. I think that's sort of what he's saying. If this is the right interpretation, then this is not to deny the value of science and causal stories, right? It's just to point out that when we consider human experience, it might take some special effort to stick with the things that appear in experience. Why tricky? Why is this? Might this be tricky? Well, in a scientific age, we love to think we can explain everything scientifically. But I'm thinking that when I'm experiencing things, the causal story doesn't really help. Let me try and illustrate this. The other day I was walking along and I heard what I thought sounded like a human cry for help. Ah! Human cry for help. Well, what did I hear? I heard what I thought was a human cry for help. I didn't hear an acoustic blast of energy that sets in motion my perceptual auditory equipment. Does that make sense? Well, this brings us to the next big thing that is being said. Let's have a look at that. One of Heidegger's most innovative and important insights is that human existence is grounded in our always already finding ourselves in a world. Okay, that's Rothel saying that. So it's Rothel's opinion, of course. But let's at least start by trusting him. Now, innovative means that few people have thought about this before. So, thought about what? Well, thought about the grounding of human existence as being in our always already finding ourselves in a world. Are always already finding ourselves in a world. Interesting phrase. What does it mean exactly? What do you think? Apparently it's a big deal, and not many people have thought this before, so it would be good to have a go at trying to explain it. Well, I can imagine that you might be thinking that the idea that we find ourselves in a world seems kind of a trivial, if not a rather obvious claim. Is Rothel joking? Perhaps it's the other bit we have to consider, the always already bit. Perhaps it means that we can't but not find ourselves in a world. I suppose that's saying something a bit different. Or perhaps Heidegger means something special about his use of the concept of world. I notice Rothel didn't say the world. But whatever, it doesn't yet seem, if we haven't read any more of Rothel's text, to seem all that special. Okay, Rothel, I hope you're going to explain what all the fuss is about. But his next line reads thus: a mind, as traditionally conceived, not as Heidegger conceives it, but as traditionally conceived, can exist without a world. And he then goes on to tell us about this tradition, this way of thinking about minds. Now, if you read the entire paragraph on page 10, it turns out that what makes Heidegger innovative then is something he challenges within the history of Western philosophy. But still, what's the big whoop exactly? Why would believing that a mind can exist without a world, the thing that Heidegger challenges, is so bad? Rothel mentions Descartes here as a philosopher who seemed to believe that this is possible. For Descartes, the mind can exist without the world. While Heidegger, to the contrary, argues that having thoughts and feelings is only possible for an entity who is actively engaged in the world. I think this phrase, engaged in the world, might throw some more light on all this, perhaps. It's not just that we just find ourselves in a world. I mean, that's Heidegger's insight. But that we are engaged with the world. All right, that still might not sound like much yet, but in the same paragraph, Rothel goes on to say that Heidegger dedicates a considerable portion of being and time to a detailed phenomenological description of what is involved in being in a world. So now it's starting to sound a bit more interesting, perhaps. So let's summarise. That's always a good thing to do, is to kind of put into words what you think is being said so far. Let's summarise it all. Heidegger wants us to consider that minds cannot exist without being in a world. Our minds are more than brains in vats, for example. Also, it's not just that humans always find themselves in a world, but that they are also engaged in worlds. I think that comes out pretty clearly. Heidegger apparently has gone to considerable trouble to try and describe in a phenomenologically sensitive way what's involved in the way humans are involved in worlds. I mean, we haven't seen much of that description yet, but that's what Rothel tells us he does. Okay, this does sound a bit puzzling though, especially that last point. I mean, I'm involved in worlds in many ways, as surely we all are, right? Are we to expect that Heidegger will give us some kind of a general account of this involvement, something that will apply to any and every involvement? Well, how would he do that? And also, why would he do it? Perhaps it has something to do with what it means to experience things phenomenologically, to go back to what we started with. Anyway, Rothel apparently offers us a clue to all this in the way he ends the paragraph on pages 10 to 11. Let's have a look at that. Heidegger argues that the philosophical tradition has overlooked the true character of the world and the nature of our human existence in a world. Okay, so in other words then, we're promised a view of world that is different to the way it has been thought about and how humans or minds are engaged in the world. Or is it worlds? And this must be a big deal, because he also wants to call human beings by a special word. He calls the kind of entity that we humans are Dasein, German word. Ooh, okay, well, let's pause again. According to Rothel, then, Heidegger wants us to consider that humans are always already in a world. They are involved in worlds, and this involvement is going to be somehow described in some general way. Okay? The true character of the world needs to be understood, and because it apparently isn't understood very well, and perhaps this has something to do with a non-causal phenomenological way of thinking about human experience. And finally, all this is part of understanding the nature of our human existence. Okay, I'm sensing, though I can't say it too clearly right now, that this understanding of human existence is going to be different to a scientific account of life. Actually, thinking that doesn't really shock me, because I've always thought that art, music, poetry, religion can embody truths. But I can imagine that it might shock some people who think that scientific explanations are really the only reliable way to get at the truth of things. Where do you stand on that, by the way? Do you think that there needs to be a grounding for truth that all people ought to subscribe to? All right, I'm sorry for that last question. It was a heavy one, and we don't have to come to any conclusions about it too soon. In fact, it's probably a good idea not to come to any conclusions too soon about a question as big as that. But it's important, isn't it? So I do hope we get to share our thoughts on this in class. Well, anyway, back to the book for the time being. In the next paragraph, I was very struck by this sentence. We are a Dasein because of the way we exist in the world. Now, this comes halfway through the paragraph, a paragraph that is attempting to explain why Heidegger chooses to use an invented word to refer to human being. But I think you might miss a really extraordinary implication of this. Let me explain what I'm thinking here. If we read, "We are Dasein" as "we are human beings," okay, then the sentence basically seems to say that human beings are human beings because of the way they exist in the world. Right? Human beings are human beings because of the way they exist in the world. Well, this implies that existence has a way. That there are ways to exist, or ways to be the thing we are. I mean, I don't mean that there are ways to be whatever it is we are. Say, ways to be a dog, or ways to be human, ways to be Jed. I mean, that's true and rather obvious. No, I'm saying something a bit different here. What I mean is that being human is itself a way of being or existing. And to be a dog is to be or exist differently again. maybe to be a stone or a rock or a number is different yet again. Anyway, I'm tempted to go off and think more about all this. And there are ways of being, or that a thing is a way of being. Well, we'll have to explore this in more detail, but straight away you can see that this thinking is very different to scientific thinking. Scientific thinking concerns itself with what things are and how they work or function, but not that things are and how they exist. In a way, science seems to take existence for granted. But I'm kind of getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let's stick with the Rothel text. If we are a Dasein because of the way we exist in the world, the next question then is, well, what is distinctive about the human way to exist? Well, Rothel tells us that Heidegger points out that in other words, Dasein always has a there, a place in which it understands how to comport itself and within which it has meaningful relationships to other entities. The literal translation of Dasein is their being. A way of being that has a there, is always in a situation kind of thing. What does it mean to say we, human beings, are always in a situation, always having a there? Press pause and have a go at trying to articulate this. Well, one way I might put it is to say that human beings can never be isolated and neutral. We always find ourselves as someone doing something in some practice, even if we can't explicitly say what it is. And so we always have some perspective from which we are interpreting things. So, thinking metaphorically here, I might say that even when we metaphorically take in the vista of a landscape, when we're taking in the vista of a landscape, we're not in the landscape, we're looking at it. But still, we're nevertheless somewhere. Perhaps we're on another hill or in a helicopter. All right, well, let's go back to the text. Dasein is an entity which in its very being comports itself understandingly towards that being. Well, this is a direct quote from Heidegger himself, the man himself. The phrase in its very being I take to mean something like, in terms of the way it exists. So the sentence would say, Dasein, human beings, is an entity, a thing, that in terms of the way it exists, comports itself understandingly towards that being. What's being said here? Now, this strikes me as not a common thing to say, so we have to tread a bit carefully. Rothel helps us a bit with explaining the use of the word comport. Comport means to carry ourselves in a certain way or style, and Heidegger is saying that we're always comporting. Okay. Here's a question. What if I don't want to carry myself in any particular way? And the answer might be, I suspect, then that would still be a way of comporting oneself. Get it? So I'm thinking then that this comporting business, this comporting aspect of being human, kind of leaves us no choice. Or rather, it's not about choice. It's just the perspective we always already have on the world. We're always already comporting. I hope that's okay so far. But as the quote suggests, we comport ourselves understandingly towards that being. Rothel offers the following gloss on that. He says that means that very particular thing a Dasein does grows out of a certain style or manner of existing in the world and in acting. Dasein relates itself to that understanding of its being. That's probably worth reading more than once. Let me try a gloss on this. Human beings do things. Of course they do. But whatever they do grows out of a certain style of how they are in the world. This is the comportment bit. If I was a bushman from the Kalahari Desert, say, in Central Africa, and you're looking at Central Africa now, whatever I do as a bushman, the intelligibility of the action grows out of being a bushman. Of being a bushman. Not out of being a European medieval monk or a 21st century white professor in a liberal arts college. If I was such a bushman, whatever I do is related to that particular bushman understanding of being that I have, or would have if I were one. So I think this is partly what is meant by saying that human beings are always comporting themselves understandingly. Our actions come out of and are intelligible in terms of our comporting ourselves understandingly towards our being, towards what we are. As we shall see then, this ultimately also means that we can be responsible for our being, for who we are. Perhaps Dasein's way of being is unique in this regard too, but more on that later. Although, talking about myself, it does make sense. I do sense that being a father, being a husband, being a teacher are never resolved matters for me. What it means to be each of these things is always something I project into the future and am responsible for. I never sort of wake up in the morning and go, aha, I know what it means to be a father or a husband or a teacher. And then it's a simple plain sailing from then on. It always requires inventing it as I go along in a sense. Anyway, that's just a by the by. We'll come back to this kind of question later. So let's go back to the text though. So far, Rothel has been mostly concentrating on Heidegger's account of human beings. He now goes on to discuss Heidegger's notion of being more generally, and the being of non-human things, like hammers. This is an example, famous example, I suppose, that Heidegger uses. Hammers. All right, so let's review something. Humans are, period. Animals are, period. Well, hammers are, period. But as we've seen, Heidegger believes in a multiplicity of ways of being. The being of humans, the being of animals, and the being of things like hammers are not the same. So how are meaningful objects like hammers? So how are they? How do they have their beings? This is a tricky way to ask the question. How are they? I know that they exist, but how do they exist? Well, Heidegger argued that Dasein and meaningful objects, like park benches and hammers, have ways of being that cannot be reduced to possessing physical properties. Meaningful objects have as their mode of being involvement with other meaningful things. If my reading of these texts is annoying, just press the pause button and read it yourself. I hope you're doing that. Okay, well, I've just processed that, and it does sound a little bit counterintuitive. I mean, you would think that a hammer is its physical properties. I mean, it has a shaft, often made of wood for holding. It has a heavy blob of tough metal fixed securely to it. This is what a hammer is, surely. Yet Heidegger says that a meaningful object like this cannot be reduced to possessing physical properties. I mean, he is certainly not denying that a hammer has physical properties, that's important. But it's just that its way of being cannot be reduced to these. If we're interested in the way a hammer exists, we mustn't assume that it's just a matter of physical properties. Interesting. Why not? What is its way of being, then? Well, he tells us here, or Rothel tells us here, the answer simply is its way of being is involvement with other meaningful things. Okay, so a hammer is, then, this is what we're asked to believe here, a hammer is what it is because of its relationship to other things, like what? Well, like nails, perhaps, boards, and activities like hammering. To understand a hammer, then, means to use it appropriately, to engage with it and participate with it in a practice where hammers make sense, such as the practice of putting in nails or building or carpentry. Hammers don't exist outside such a web of relationships, is what's being claimed here, I think. Only looking at the physical properties of the hammer, even if we were to go into meticulous detail and find out such things as the atomic structure of what a hammer might be made of, would not by itself get us to see and understand a hammer as a hammer. That's what's being claimed. I'd love to hear what you think of all this. What do you think? What's wrong, if anything, with saying that a hammer exists as a certain kind of bundle of wood and metal? Have a think about this before moving on. Okay, I'm not going to share what I think quite yet, but I'll reinforce the question again by some things Rothel says next in the text. He says this. I'll let you read it. He then goes on to say, the way dirt has its being is a matter of physicality. This is different to the hammer. In this regard, then, why might it be different for hammers? Do hammers and dirt exist in different ways? That is the implication here. Well, whatever the way of being is of dirt versus hammers, the chapter ends by going back to the way of being of humans and why Heidegger is innovative. Why he is significant in the history of philosophy. So, to recap, the being of humans is Dasein, which basically means we are always in a context or world. We're always in a context or world. And our actions, at least intelligible ones, depend on this. Well, the next chapter will focus specifically on this notion of world, very important idea for Heidegger. But we get a taste of it even in this chapter on pages 14 to 15. And we're introduced to this fellow, actually. I think he maybe mentioned even earlier than this. René Descartes. He's a famous French philosopher of the 17th century. And it's really hard to grasp the extent of influence this man's thinking has had on us in the West. And maybe still does have. What I'm suggesting is that many of us think like Cartesians. That just means a follower of Descartes. So many of us think like Cartesians, even if we don't realise it. And we'll need to spend a bit more time with this man's ideas and philosophy. But since it's this, I think the second time he's mentioned in this first chapter, we ought to take note of some of his thinking right now, especially since his views are being contrasted with Heidegger's. In fact, in some ways, it's as though Heidegger was doing his philosophy in opposition to this man, Descartes. Although I have to say Heidegger is in opposition to many other Western thinkers, but Descartes is one of the big targets for sure. Well, what is Descartes' basic approach that seems so objectionable? According to Descartes, then, we are subjects. What does that mean? Well, it means that we're beings with mental states and experiences which can be what they are independently of the state of the surrounding world. Rothel quotes Descartes with these words. This is actually from the man himself, from Descartes himself, translated obviously. Now, if this is true, we might be tempted to think that humans are humans because they have this sort of wonderful power of reasoning. And not only this, that we would also be radically free. Radically free? Why radically free? Well, as Jean-Paul Sartre, another French philosopher, but more contemporary, as he thinks, we would be able to change who we are simply by changing how we think about things. And you may like the sound of that. I like the sound of that because it seems we'd have a lot of control. We just have to think about things in a certain way to be the person we'd like to be. In other words, thinking, or cognition, I want to use a fancy term for it, would play a defining role in being human. But whatever the attractiveness of thinking this way, it's not what Heidegger believes. As Rothel puts it, see, this means that we're not radically free like Sartre would have it, though we can still take responsibility for our being. And all of this follows from a very different way of thinking about human beings. Not as subjects trying to find their way in an objective world, but to recognize that we are beings in a world. Yes, Heidegger. As Heidegger explains, the hyphens are very important because they emphasize that this is a unitary phenomena. There's not two things, being and world. There's only one thing, and being and world depend on each other. It's a unitary phenomenon. Oh. As such, then, the world gives humans a domain in which we are free to act. But also gives us standards to which we can simply submit. Simply submit. Now, this image of Hitler is particularly appropriate because Heidegger was himself, at least for one period of his life, not the best interpreter of his own philosophy. Now, as we will see, authenticity, owning up to the fact that Dasein doesn't have any fixed way it must be, is a thrilling but awesome responsibility that Heidegger's philosophy would suggest we take seriously. And the authentic human being, or Dasein, does take this seriously. However, early on in his career, Heidegger himself succumbs to having a disastrous relationship with Nazism. And this has certainly tarnished his moral reputation, and a question is bound to arise from that. Does this tarnishing also mean that his philosophy must be also hopelessly corrupted? Well, my feeling is that to be in a position to answer that question, we must first really spend some quality time with the philosophy itself. And I hope this presentation has helped a little towards that end. It's a beginning at any rate. So, thanks for watching. See you in class.